This is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson.
Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. Where do our rights come from? From where do we derive our rights? Sort of foundational question, right? It's interesting. Some sort of self-styled libertarian-ish conservatives, ironically, think our rights come from government programs. How many instances of this have we seen? Get the government out of the marriage business by getting the government in the marriage business, to redefine it. Get the government out of the relationship between myself and my doctor. By setting up an assisted suicide program. Sort of a conundrum, isn't it? We're going to enshrine our individual sovereignty by establishing a government program to do it. That doesn't strike you as a contradiction in terms? It should. We've talked about assisted suicide a number of times, the so-called death with dignity movement, mainly with Wesley Smith. He's written a lot on the topic. But we've got now 10 states that have the government involved in helping you kill yourself or helping family members help you kill yourself. And I know what people think is they hearken back to when this was more of a national debate in the days of Jack Kevorkian. And you have these terrible situations where people are afflicted with terrible diseases, and there is no hope, at least that's what the professionals would say, no hope in some of these cases for a person to get better, and often that's true. You know, think of somebody with ALS, for example. But there's that reality, and then there's institutionalizing government power to deliver the dose. Because I don't know, I don't know how many programs we have to have on how many fronts before it starts to resonate with people, particularly conservatives, that every government program is not only subject to, it's almost incentivized for mission creep. And so that's what's happened. This is only for people with a debilitating disease where there is no hope and the pain is unbearable. Right. And these are very sympathetic situations. You know, people are in terrible situations, suffering terribly, and of course the natural instinct is to have great empathy and sympathy for them and say, well, if you can't go on, I understand. Okay. But then when it's institutionalized in government, like it is up there in Canada, their MAID program. I love these Orwellian acronyms. I mean, good grief. You know, national healthcare, the government-run healthcare in Britain is NICE. That's the acronym. And MAID. Oh, I'm just going to help, clean you up right out of here. Oh, an aid program.
That's nice.
Where, for example, a depressed man was euthanized for hearing loss because he refused to wear his cochlear implant. Is that what you had in mind for the government aiding and abetting people killing themselves?
Millions of Americans have cochlear implants. Not a reason.
Getting down into kids, we've told you these stories, and you may say, well, those are outliers. Well, the problem is when you have a government agency in business to kill people, that's what they do. And they look for outlier cases to expand their mission field. And that's what's happening. Our next guest tells us a story of a Navy veteran who wanted to go one way, wanted to be out of here, wanted to leave this mortal coil. And now he's going the other way as part of a group that is litigating California's End-of-Life Options Act, alleging it discriminates against people with disabilities. For more on this, we're pleased to be joined by F. Billy McMorris, Academic Director for the National Journalism Center and a contributing editor for The Spectator. Mr. McMorris, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Amy.
Tell us the story of Lonnie Van Hook.
So Lonnie Van Hook is a quadriplegic from Oakland, a Navy veteran, and he was contemplating moving from California to Oregon to go and end his life. And he happened to collapse en route to Oregon and was brought to a medical facility in California. And when they found out the reason that he was going to Oregon, they were like, "Oh, Lonnie, you can starve yourself to death right here. We can do that here." So it wasn't until the intervention of...
Boy, that is good news, Doctor. Yeah.
But Mr. Van Hook has joined these disability groups that are saying that for disabled people like Lonnie, the standard of care for suicide prevention goes out the window. So disabled people are getting a different set of treatment than if I were to call up my doctor and say, I'm going to kill myself, authorities would do everything in their power to stop me from doing that. But when Mr. Van Hook expresses suicidal ideation, he is aided because the doctors look at him and they go, well, you're a quadriplegic, you have a low quality of life, you have a terminal disease, ergo, we don't need to provide you suicide prevention, we need to provide you suicide. But don't worry, it is totally up to you. And I think you nailed you hit the nail on the head when you discussed how we need a government program to come in and litigate these sorts of things, and how it's actually inviting the government into the end-of-life business. But what's even more funny than that is that this is tort reform. Assisted suicide bills are made to make sure that doctors can't be prosecuted for helping patients kill themselves. And that's what people don't realize about it. Every time they come up with a fancy acronym like MAID or Death with Dignity, what it's really covering up is they're trying to help doctors escape prosecution and litigation from grieving family members who see these doctors betraying the Hippocratic Oath in order to bring about the death of their patients.
Well, how many states have legalized assisted suicide?
So currently it is 10 states and the District of Columbia. And Nevada could be looking at becoming the next state to legalize it. And what's funny is many of these, as funny as this can be, when assisted suicide first arrived on the map, it was through litigation in a few legislation in a few far left states like Oregon. But as well as through litigation, people suing, saying that their doctor won't kill them, and it's a human right that they should be able to kill themselves with the assistance of a doctor. And that's how Canada went about legalizing assisted suicide. So Mr. Van Hook and these disability groups are basically trying to use the liberal playbook in order to save lives here. They're basically saying, hey, you guys are discriminating against us since somebody living with a terminal disease is ipso facto a disabled person. And you're creating a two-tiered medical system based off of the prognostications of a few doctors. So it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out, because thus far, legal challenges have been to assisted suicide have been thrown out on technical standing grounds, but this whole case in California is based off of a very progressive reading of the law.
And rather than what's St. Jude's, rather than like have children's hospitals, I'm thinking of Margot Thomas, right, doing those commercials for St. Jude Children's Hospitals, raising money for kids with terminal disease to aid them and so forth. Going the other way in Canada, Abel Peltier was only 4 years old when his mother began petitioning the Canadian Parliament to allow a physician to take his life in a medically assisted suicide. He has a rare condition called Mednick syndrome. It's incurable, although medications can manage certain aspects of the condition. So is that when people are thinking about, this is my point about bringing up Kevorkian in the opening, they think about that. They think about the elderly person who's probably a short timer and maybe is in excruciating pain. Are you thinking about 4-year-olds with a terminal, with a serious illness, maybe a terminal illness, but maybe there's aspects you can manage, and that person has potentially a lot more time if you can mitigate some of the symptoms and alleviate some of the pain. But hey, here we are. We're ready to move if you are.
That's exactly right. When Canada first was forced by its Supreme Court to legalize assisted suicide, only about 1,000 people used it. And within 5 years, it had increased tenfold. It had become one of the leading causes of death in Canada in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic. And that is not because terminal illnesses suddenly shot up. It was because Canada started with, only if you're in the last few years of your life and you're super elderly. And within 5 years, they had expanded the criteria.
To a 4-year-old.
And
potentially
they're on the verge of legalizing it for minors who they said would never be affected by this.
Right.
They are on the verge of legalizing it for people who are mentally ill. So,
right.
Hey, have severe depression. Go ahead. We will.
The gallows are right out back. Yeah, right. Absolutely.
And not only that, the Canadian health system is cheering the fact that this assisted suicide program saves them hundreds of millions of dollars every year in healthcare expenditures.
Of course, people are burdens. I get it. Yeah, especially kids. They're going to be a burden for 60, 70, 80 years maybe, and you can avoid those burdens. That's wonderful. It's terribly enlightened. The assisted suicide with kids to mature minors, so meaning with parental consent. And oh boy, parental consent, like that's the end all be all these days. The same parents that are consenting to have their children mutilated because they have succumbed to the siren song of the trans movement and so on and so forth. I mean, without getting into that, just the idea of parental consent to deprive a living human being of their God-given rights, not government program conferred rights. That's a problem, at least as it should be in this country if it's not in Canada.
Well, we've already seen several states take up legislation that says that if parents do not consent to their child transitioning, that it is tantamount to child abuse because
right.
You're getting in the way of your child's relationship with the doctor. I could easily envision some lawyers out there in a couple years, if we allow the assisted suicide juggernaut to continue, suing and alleging child abuse because these parents won't consent to having their child killed by assisted suicide.
Well,
that sounds like a ridiculous scenario, but I'm sure in Canada 5 years ago, it seemed very ridiculous that minors could ever be even contemplated as being able to win assisted suicide rights, as they call them.
And in the West in general, we're talking about the mental health crisis among young people coming out of COVID. You had the Surgeon General, Dr. Vivek Murthy, talking about the deleterious impact on children's mental state that social media has, the continuous use of social media. So, boy, we're going to have a lot of people lined up at the mill, it sounds like, if the pro-death lobby has their way.
Yes, these are called deaths with despair when a doctor is involved, but all of a sudden they become death with dignity when somebody commits suicide under the loving gaze of a national health system.
And some people do it
Well
in the name
said.
of climate change, too, I'm sure. Because people aren't having kids, they say, because they're trying to save the planet. So do you think that'll be a factor in on it?
Oh, my goodness. Climate despair becoming a factor. Well, I guess that would be considered a mental illness, so we'll see how Canada handles that one. But, look north if you want to see what the future looks like under an aid in dying. All of these protections that the Death with Dignity folks promise will be in their regime, they all roll away very, very quickly. And luckily in the U.S., it is limited to a few states and the District of Columbia. But if you keep the ball rolling on this, Canada is definitely looking like the way of the future.
Yeah, and it's exactly the conversation we had yesterday with Dr. Jonathan Ellen about nudging and the use by the medical profession of behavioral sciences to sort of nudge people in the right direction. This is what was happening in California with Mr. Van Hook, which, hey, it's your call, but, you should probably maybe think about going this way. Yeah, the soft tyranny of the medical profession these days. It's pretty dystopian stuff, and we appreciate you documenting it. He is F. Billy McMorris, academic director for the National Journalism Center, contributing editor for the Spectator as well. Thank you for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, Dan and Amy.
Thank you, and he joined us on our Turnkey.pro answer line.
Listen to Dan and Amy